Snow came softly and without end, a steady quiet that crept into every seam of leather and wool, whispering on the fields that had known so much trampling and blood the year before. Winterfell's towers loomed like dark teeth, their banners raw against the pale sky. Jon watched from the ridge while dusk seeped into the valleys, and the cold braided itself into his breath and beard. Ghost stood beside him, white against white, a shadow only because all else was gray. The direwolf's ears flicked at nothing Jon could see. "You could take him now," Tormund said behind him, stamping his boots, beard rime-flecked. "He's a chopped tree boy. For all his barking, he hides behind stone. And stone is stubborn," Davos said, voice level as an oar's stroke. He had stood quiet a long while, as if letting the snow do the talking. "Starve a castle and you starve a man's courage. Try to take the walls and you feed them brave men." Sansa's fur hood framed her face, the auburn dull in this light. She stared past the ridge toward the black shape of the godswood and the pale shimmer of the hot springs that threaded smoke into the air. Her hands were wrapped in dark gloves, one smoothing the other's fingers as if needing a thought. "He expects a charge," she said. "It's what he wants. If we give it to him, he will make a show of Rickon, and it will break you." Jon didn't answer at once. He felt the dread and the longing, like two cords pulled in opposite directions beneath his ribs. He could see Rickon as the boy had been years ago, wild with the wolves, untamed and laughing in the snow, hair plastered to his brow. He could see him as the boy he was now under Ramsay's eye, and that vision was a knife he could not wrench out. "You wrote to the Vale," Jon said at last, not accusing, not even questioning, merely speaking a fact between them as if to set it on the cold air. Sansa's eyes flicked to his. "I did," she said. "I will not apologize for wanting help against a monster." Her chin lifted. "But do not depend on it. Depend on yourself and on the men who already bleed for you." Tormund spat into the snow. "The longer we wait, the more our bellies gnaw. Wildlings don't take to standing in lines and watching smoke." "Nor Northmen," said small Lady Mormont, "come near without anyone noticing." She had a talent for it. She stood with the certainty of someone twice her height. "But the alternative is foolishness. Let him rot." Jon turned to Davos. The old smuggler did not look away from Winterfell. "If you wait," Davos said, "you must truly wait. No sally, no rage at a taunt. Build fires where wind can't steal their warmth. Rotate watches. Make a ring of pickets and a deeper ring of ditches. Take every farmyard within a day's ride and every store of grain. You will not be loved for it by small folk, but they know who sits behind those walls. Do it and do not blink until you're ready. And when the time comes, do not trumpet it." Jon drew breath. It felt like dragging a net through ice. Sansa's gaze was steady. Tormund's was restless. Ghost's red eyes were as patient as night. "We wait," Jon said. The words left his mouth and left behind a hollow that fear could have rushed into. Instead, a steel edge slid into it. He had loved charging into the impossible once or twice, when the wind screamed and the blood climbed and choice seemed a river you could ride. But he had died for that once. The cold remembered. Through that night, the first orders spread like embers caught in tinder. Men with axes went to tear down the barren orchards to timber for palisades. The thud of metal and the rend of frozen would a slow drum. Others dug with shovels and pickaxes, turning winterlocked dirt by the light of torches, cussing softly. They set stakes and stretched ropes and measured out the distance the bolts could fly from Winterfell's walls. The wildlings worked in bellows breath bursts. The Northmen worked in dogged silence, spitting on their palms. Davos drew lines in the dirt with a stick, and men built where he pointed. A ring formed, not pretty, not clean, but stubborn. There was a pattern to hunger and to cold. The first week the camp shouted and laughed, reckless and defiant. The second week, the sound of laughter thinned, replaced by the creak of leather as men drew cloaks tighter and the quiet hiss of meat as it struck a pan. Rarer and rarer. The third week, the camp learned to move like wolves, waste nothing, share warmth in huddles like seals on a rock. Jon walked the lines each day, Ghost padding silent beside him. answering questions with eyes and with a hand on a shoulder. He was not a man of many speeches. He had seen too many men die to want to hear his own voice. He listened to Tormund complain and tease. He listened to Davos measure. He listened to a dozen petty grievances and small bravery. He put his hand on heads and took a share of the night watch and never let the fear of Rickon's fate pull him from the discipline he had chosen. From Winterfell there were torches at night that moved along the walls like fireflies trapped in a jar. There were horns at odd hours meant to unnerve. Jon did not answer them. Once a rider came with a white flag and a letter in a fine, sharp hand. It named Jon Bastard in 3 different ways and promised him a skin to match the flayed banners. It noted that the dogs were hungry. It spoke of Rickon with a casual cruelty that made Jon's fingers curl in the paper. Sansa burned the letter to ash at the edge of the campfire and said nothing while Davos watched the flame eat the last line. "He wants a storm in your head," Davos said. "He needs you mad. He is empty without it." "Then let him be empty," Sansa said. Her voice was a cool blade. Inside Winterfell, the snow was not so deep where the heat of the springs ran in hidden arteries beneath the courtyard stones. Ramsay sat in the great hall and stripped a leg of meat with his teeth, grease shining at his mouth, while Maester W. Alkin read stores and measures. The Maester's nervous cough was a candle flame in a draft. "The grain will stretch," Wolkin said, "into a 4th month if we keep to strict rationing. The glass gardens will continue to give greens, some solace, though not substance, Ramsay said, the word a gentle mockery. He tossed the bone to one of his hounds. The dog snapped and shivered with delight. Substance is for men who believe they're going to live long enough to enjoy it. He wiped his fingers on a kerchief and leaned back. "What perhaps you meant to say, Maester, is that all is well, because I am here and I have thought of everything." Harold Karstark stood near the hearth, the fire painting him in orange and gold. "A siege is for cowards, my lord," Harold said, yawning. "Let us ride out, cut the throat of the waiting. Their wild men don't love order. Their tents burn like hay." "An admirable thought," Ramsay said pleasantly. "The last time I burned a camp, it belonged to a Baratheon. He had no wild men, but he had a king's banner. That was fun. The trick is to make a little noise and then make silence. Men fear silence more." He cocked his head. "It is cold tonight. Dogs run better when cold. Send out 6 with a score of men each. Not the same gates, not the same hour. Get them running. Fire what you can. Bring back a head." He smiled thinly. "Any head will do." The first raid came in a swirl of snow and darkness, quick-footed in boots wrapped with cloth, hounds low as smoke, men with torches bound tight so wind couldn't wrench flame free. They slipped through a sally port and came down like wolves upon a flock, burning a stack of kindling laid for the next night's fires, cutting ropes, slitting throats of sentries. Could have been a rout. It was a beginning. Tormund met them in a rush, his axe swinging low enough to take legs from beneath men before they saw the arc. One came like a tower moving of its own accord, one huge hand closing around a burning brand and using it to swat men from their feet like sparks from a log. Jon's sword was quiet and cold in his hand, and he moved with that old economy that came from 1,000 drills. No panic, no flourish, an answer to each angle. Ghost took a hound straight on. They tumbled in a snarling knot, and when they rose the direwolf shook his head once, red at the muzzle. The raiders got what fire they could to kiss the edge of the palisade. Then they melted back, leaving 3 of their dead where they fell. Jon looked at the men who had died with his blood in them and said nothing. He had expected this. He had not lied to himself about it. "Let him play," Davos murmured. "He thinks a raid is a wedge he can pound. Isn't it?" Tormund asked, breathing hard, grinning like a man who had found a game he could understand. "It will be if we answer him loud," Davos said. "So save your grin for the day we open the gates." Sansa stood in the ward flamelight and watched the last sparks die in the snow. "He will send you a gift," she said to Jon, and her breath smoked like omen. "He sent them to my wedding once when it snowed. He believes gifts win wars. He believes everyone is like him, John said. The wind scoured the ridge. He pulled the cloak tighter. We won't teach him otherwise with a sword in his guts. He only learns when his own blood betrays him. When the second raid stole out, the pickets saw them too early and the signal horns nagged the night. The men inside Winterfell heard the horns and knew the hills had grown teeth. A third raid failed when a postern gate stuck half shut with ice and the men behind trampled each other in panic while the hounds filled the quiet with their broken music. Ramsay, who had never lacked for appetite, chewed and smiled and sent more men. He flayed one who had lost his torch in the snow, because the gods love discipline, he said. Behind his jokes, the pantry count was a burn he would not scratch. There is always more, he had always believed. That was how the world worked. There was always a weaker man to take from. There was always a soft, warm place somewhere you could crack and crawl into. Now the walls he possessed came to feel like a lid. Maester Wolkan watched his lord with shadowed eyes and thought of letters he would never send. In the kitchens, a girl named Bess bent her shoulders over pots and watched the men return with snow ice to their beards and a yellowish hunger at the corners of their eyes. She heard the kennel master tie up the hounds tighter, rationing their meat. She carried soup to guards and slipped an extra ladle to one old man who had served the Starks once and kept a bit of cloth with a direwolf sewn on in the inside of his boot. At night, when she could, she crept to a corner of the cellars where the warm air rose and told stories softly to a boy with a wolf's eyes who didn't smile. She did not call him by name because names were knives here, but the stories always had a boy and a wolf, and sometimes the wolf was the wiser. If a man goes to the gods' wood, the boy whispered once, voice a scratch of twig. The trees know his truth. They do, she whispered back, but you must be clever to get there. I was clever once, the boy said. A girl told me to climb tall and watch, but my feet are loud now. Outside, the ditches deepened. The stores grew. Men seeking glory learned to seek warmth. The camp took in 2 families from a farm to the west and their stores of barley. They had to give over their mules, which made the farmer silent with grief until Davos clapped his arm and said, I'll give them back if they outlive this. If not, we'll eat before we freeze. The farmer nodded. That was justice enough in winter. On a morning of white sun and hard snow, banners were seen to the east, blue and gray and silver in the distance. A line of men came like a quiet river over the hump of the land. The Vale had come, their lords in bright enamel and fur, their cav. Auri straight-backed. Peter Baelish came at their center like a pin that holds a fine cloak. When he dismounted before Jon and Sansa, he wore a smile crafted to survive weather. My lady, he said, bowing. My lord, how strange to see Winterfell in winter. It has a different face. Only one thing is constant, and that is the persistence of family. Sansa regarded him as if looking through a pane of glass with ice on it. You came, she said. What else could I do? He asked, and made it sound like devotion. I had no choice but to bring what help I could. There is a debt between us, perhaps of my own making. Do not charge me too much interest. His eyes slid almost delicately to Jon and took stock. If we must sit on snow and stare at stone, then we shall do so. My men can hold their line for a very long time. We will need grain, Davos said. Your men eat too. Of course, Baelish said, as if he hadn't thought of it, as if everything he brought was a gift wrapped in itself. We have wagons. Sansa's mouth tightened. She had written for help with a thing sharp as a needle. She knew needles. She recognized the strand Baelish had tied to her letter. She let it hang without taking hold. Later, near a brazier where her hands could thaw, he drifted to her. I dreamed of Winterfell in a different season, he murmured, of green leaves and a girl with auburn hair standing in its yard. Dream something else, she said, and walked past him. He smiled, a small cut. The ring grew tighter, stronger. With the Vale men's discipline and their horses to scour the edges, no carriage made it to Winterfell. A wagon tried under a white flag with a fat man driving and a child crying. Inside were 18 sacks of barley and 24 small knives beneath wool blankets and a letter that offered mercy to any man named Bolton who liked money better than duty. Vale archers found the knives and took the barley and let the child pass to a shepherd's hut with her mother. Rumor of the knives reached Winterfell and cost the fat man his head before he saw his hearth again. In the great hall, Ramsay ate more slowly and drank more wine. He imagined Jon outside his walls and saw him too calm. He liked men who raged. Rage was a lever he could press. He sent another letter full of cartoon threats, full of skinned metaphors. Jon burned that one himself. He kept the seal, the snarling flayed man, just to feel the weight of it in his hand sometimes and remind himself what he had set to end. At night Jon dreamed. He had thought the siege would be a page in a book he would write later in his mind. Instead it bled into his bones. That night Bess found the old man with the direwolf cloth gone from his boot. She found his body behind the stables, snow already making him gentler. She wept without sound because tears made frost on her lashes and because sound might be heard. She took the little rag of cloth and put it in her bodice and went to the cellars with a chunk of bread hidden in her sleeve. "Not too fast," she told the boy, pressing it into his hand, and he obeyed, nibbling as if it were a secret he didn't dare be caught with. "When the time comes," she said, though she did not know why she said it, only that the words led somewhere she had to believe in. "When the time comes, you must run like a wolf, not like a boy. Wolves don't run in houses," he said and smiled a little, and that was a knife too, but a kind one that cut a knot. Snow deepened, and then there came a day with the light thin as paper. The sky was a crusted gray and the cold held still, as if watching. Jon studied the castle with a spyglass, glass biting his glove. He knew Winterfell's lines the way he knew a scar on his own hand. Still it looked different now. The broken tower seemed less sad and more impatient. The Godswood was a smudge where there should be blood-red leaves. The smoke of the hot springs rose in steady breaths as if the castle were a beast sleeping with its mouth closed tight. "What are you seeing?" Davos asked. "Time," Jon said, "and the end of it." He lowered the glass. He had thought once that victory would feel like a shout. This felt like the very last footstep before a silence broke. "He's near done." "How can you tell?" Tormund asked. "He will do something stupid," Jon said. "Stupider than flaying a man for losing a torch." He looked at the hill and felt the decision moving under his feet like ice settling. "When he does, we must be waiting." The stupid thing came in an afternoon that rolled the sun behind ragged cloud and sent W.I.N.D. from the east in hard blows. Ramsay ordered his men to seize 3 of the town's elders, the men who'd once seen to the barley and the pigs and the glass gardens, and bring them to the yard. He accused them loudly of hoarding grain and summoned each man's wife and daughter. It was theater. It was his favorite game. He meant to demonstrate that he was still the center, that fear still obeyed him. In the second row of men watching, someone coughed and did not hide it. Ramsay's eyes slipped like a knife. He had the cougher dragged forward and beaten until he was quiet. Then he took bread from the stores and fed it to the dogs, laughing. If he had been a cleverer man, he would have smiled and walked away. Instead, he stood and watched the dogs gnaw and meant everyone to see him watching, as if his gaze could remain a weapon when his forces dwindled to bone. From the wall, Wolkan met the eyes of Harold Karstark, and something cold that had always lived inside the maester uncurled in a different shape. The Karstark looked hungry. He looked angry. He did not look persuaded. Small cracks, Wolkan thought. In stone, water makes them. That night, a candle burned in a window of the old broken tower. The flame trembled like a heartbeat. Jon saw it. Sansa saw it. And someone within Winterfell saw it, too, and turned away as if he hadn't. "You knew about that candle," Jon said, quiet. Sansa's mouth opened and closed. "Once," she said, when I thought I had no friends left, I lit it. No one came. Someone came now," Jon said. "Or someone thinks enough to try. We don't move on a single candle." "No," Sansa said. Her voice was flat and steady as the yard stones. "We move when the gate moves." 3 nights later, the kennelmaster died in his sleep of an old man's heart. It might have happened anyway. It happened now. His nephew, A thin young man with anxious eyes who admired Ramsay from a distance the way a hawk might admire lightning, took his place. He did not know the quiet ways an old man knows. He did not know which hound to feed last so that none would snap and draw blood. He did not know which key fit which lock in the dark by the sound they made in his hand. He jangled keys at a wrong hour and woke a guard who was not supposed to be there. The guard raised his spear and then his hand and then his voice. The nephew squealed and ran. None of it mattered until it did. Bess, who had been bringing soup to the kennels and slipping a sliver of meat under the pen for a favorite bitch, lifted her head at the disturbance and saw a gap where a lock should be. She felt something pop in her chest. She was not a woman other people would point to in a crowd. But she had a boy in a cellar and a rag with a dire wolf on it in her dress, and that made a river in her. In the cellars, bricks were warm to the touch. She took the boy by the hand. "Now," she said. He looked up. His eyes had that slick blue stillness of deep cold water. "Listen to me. The kennels are ugly. There will be dogs. They know you. Don't smell of fear." She laughed then, a terrible, breathless sound. "Do as if anyone can do that. Run as if you were never fed and someone rings a bell for meat. Run like you belong to the running." "What if they see?" the boy asked. "Then be a ghost," she said. They went up, not with stealth but with a purpose that passed as belonging. The kitchens were a churn. The yard was a multitude of tasks done badly. The guards had the glassy eyes of men who know their bellies could argue them into any sin. Bess moved through them with the long habit of a woman no one had the energy to notice. At the kennel door, she slipped the wrong key and the right one, and then the door was open by inches. Air that stank of straw and old meat hit them. The dogs' bodies pressed against the wood and then checked and then pulled back. They knew her. She had fed them when others forgot. She favored one with a wheaten coat and a scar above her eye. "Go," she whispered. "Go, go." She pushed the boy through and went behind, heart thumping. The strip of corridor on the other side was just wood and packed earth. At the end of it, a door with a bolt, and beyond that the yard, and beyond that a slice of the world. They nearly made it. The nephew reappeared from nowhere, clutching keys, red-faced. He grabbed for the boy and got Bess's shoulder instead and jerked her back hard enough to make her cry out. The boy twisted. The nephew raised a hand to strike. The wheaten bitch leapt, not at his throat but at his wrist, because she loved hands and knew hands. Her teeth closed. The nephew screamed and dropped the keys. Bess shoved the bolt, shoved the door. Snow slapped their faces. Someone shouted. It was Wolken, his voice high and hard in a way no one had ever heard from him, and he pointed to a postern door by the glass gardens that slipped open when you knew where to press. They ran. The boy ran like a wolf, and for the first time since he had been brought into these walls like a package, he smiled with his teeth. The postern gate spilled them into the godswood. It was like stepping into a different age. The snow under the heart tree was thin. The air was warm as breath. The weirwood's red leaves shivered in some private wind. Bess didn't know the old gods. She touched the tree anyway with a hand red where the nephew had scratched her. "Mercy," she said, to the tree or to the air. She wasn't sure the difference. They came out the other side of the gods' wood into the ring between outer and inner walls and found Maester Wolken waiting like a foolish man. He had a cloak in one hand and a piece of bread in the other. He wrapped the cloak around the boy. "Keep your eyes on me," he hissed. "Walk as if I sent you on an errand I did not trust to anyone else. The look of that is in your face already." Bess saw his eyes and knew he would die for what he was doing. She had never thought of the maester as a man, only as gray cloth and a soft voic. Now she thought he must have had a name once, before he had decided to be a chain of its pieces. "Go," he said. They went toward the stables and the outer gate, where a succession of miseries had grown into a single large negligence. A guard leaned back, eyes closed, mouth open, cheek uneven where a man had hit him years before. He woke because Ghost was suddenly inside his dream, all white and teeth. He stumbled, stabbed with his spear, saw the tip come away bloody with wolf hair and did not understand what he had done. He bellowed, "Open! Wolken shouted, voice snapping like a whip. On the maester's orders, open. That got him the gate up 2 inches, and then a hand held it because it was stuck. He looked down. The hand was his. He had never shook so hard, and yet his fingers didn't let go. Outside the ring of ditches and palisades and Northmen and wildlings and Vale men went on being winter and war. But in that piece of it, the snow fell differently and the air felt thinner. Bess pushed the boy through. A spear came down and cracked against the wood near her head. Then a howl answered the shout from the other side. A howl like something Snow had decided to become. Ghost burst through like a thrown spear, knocked the guard aside. Men on the wall shouted. Bess tasted iron, didn't realize she'd bitten her own tongue. The boy went down in a skid on the crusted snow and came up running. He ran at Ghost's side, and for a moment anyone watching could have thought they were a story told on a hearth that Winter loved enough to turn true. John heard the howl and began to run before he knew why. He ran as if he had been set on fire and the only water was ahead. Tormund charged after him, cursing. Davos kept pace longer than he should have and then lost it, age catching his lungs. The gate was a mouth spitting men and confusion. John went through it and into a churn of shouts and wood and snow, and there, against the white, against the stone, there was Rickon Stark, eyes wide in a face he knew as if he'd held it in his hand yesterday. The boy stumbled in ice-rimed snow, arms out. John caught him. It was like catching a bird. For a heartbeat they were whole. Then reality punched. The guard raised his spear again. John turned, putting his body between the spear and the boy, and lifted his sword and cut. He did not think, because thought was a luxury. Ghost lunged at another man. Tormund's axe took a third. Men on the walls yelled and lifted crossbows, but the snow had its say, and the angles were wrong, and fear made fools. Back! John snarled to Tormund. Back! He lifted Rickon, who was all bones and fur and shiver, and ran. Pins of ice cut his lungs. Sansa came into the blur of his vision and then into the shape of herself, and she fell to her knees and put her hands on Rickon's face and made a noise John didn't recognize and would never forget. The gate came down behind them like a jaw. Bolts thudded into snow. Men cheered without wit, because sometimes the only thing men know how to do with terror is to break it with loud noise. John sank to one knee, Rickon still in his arms. He expected tears. He got a slow, disbelieving smile that cracked something he had sealed hard. I ran, Rickon said. His voice was raw. Like a wolf. John laughed, and it sounded like winter breaking a little. Later, when Rickon slept in a tent with 3 furs thrown over him and Sansa kept a hand on his shoulder as if the boy would float up if not weighted, John went back to the ridge and looked at Winterfell. He felt something on the air, some new fracture inside the walls. Hunger was now married to panic, which made a different child. He did not grin. He stood with his hands on the railing of the lookout and let the cold teach his bones patience. Wolken did not die that night. He expected to. He had made his peace with it. But Ramsay, when told of the escape, found the kennelmaster's nephew's bitten wrist more interesting, and beat him to screaming and locked him inside a pen with 2 hounds that shivered with hunger and stared at him with glassy eyes. You must prove you love them more than you love your hand, Ramsay said. The nephew babbled. Ramsay smiled. Eat less. Then they will love you enough to leave your fingers. He left the nephew with that and went to his hall, where wine and a map waited. He placed his finger on the line of ditches where the escape had happened and pressed. He had enough men to hold the walls. He had fewer than he liked to spare for raids. His dogs were losing weight. His banners hung a little lower on their poles, their cloth stiff with wet and frozen with a dryness that was not clean. He had told himself all his life that he was the wolf. He now looked out at the ring of men and found he had been the dog, owned by his appetite, chained by his choices. The next day no raids came. The day after, a rider came out under a rag of white cloth. A man of middling years with thinning hair, riding an old mare whose breath smoked, bearing a sealed letter. John took the letter and broke the seal and read it and then passed it to Davos. In it Ramsay named terms. They were absurd in the way of things written by men who sensed their dominion's end and wished to write over it. He demanded supplies, a trade of prisoners, a day's hunting in the woods, because dogs must run and men must remember who owns their teeth. He offered Rickon's shoe as a sign of sincerity, which was the first poor joke of his that no one laughed at. "No," John said, and tossed the letter into the brazier. "No more letters." "Did you keep the seal?" Sansa asked. He shook his head. She smiled without humor. "Good. I choose not to remember the shape of that man's claims." The Vale men, neat, stubborn, quiet, settled into siege like professionals in a dull trade. They built higher earthworks to guard their fires from wind. They erected a line of shields against the deeper cold. They taught the wildlings how to tie knots they'd never eat on the sea. The wildlings taught the Vale men how to piss into a hole without freezing themselves to their own shadows. Men do exchange wisdom. Days learned to pass. The moon waxed and waned out of sight because snow wrote across the sky. John's nightmares grew less sharp, perhaps because the day's purpose left little room for the night's ghosts. Sansa began to speak in the voice of the Lady of Winterfell, low, firm, not harsh, but with an expectation built into it that things should be so and would be so. When Baelish sidled at the corners of the camp like a careful cat, Sansa let him, but she left him nothing to hold. He offered possibilities like cards. She watched his hands. "We could," he would say, "apply a touch at this point, a word to that lord's ear." "We will not," she said. "The North remembers on its own." Ramsay began to execute men for small crimes, stealing a carrot, arguing with a sergeant, until even his own seemed to look sideways at one another as if disease were in the air. It made him clench his jaw in his sleep. He started awake and tasted blood. His tongue hurt, he had bitten it. The glass gardens gave greens that tasted of hope but did not fill emptiness. Firewood ran low enough that men began to pry old chairs apart. Fear became a smell. A man can stand hunger if everyone stands it. A man can stand fear if something outside him is brave. But when fear and hunger pull in the same direction, even proud men bend. He had known that in others. He had not expected to know it from within. It ended not with trumpet or clamor, but with a misjudged mourning. A barrel of barley fell as men were moving it and burst. Hands went to the grain as if to save a child. 3 men ended up on their knees, scooping, and 2 others stood over them with clubs, yelling. A sergeant stepped in, swung his own club, caught one of the scooping men on the side of the head hard enough to burst an ear. That man came up with blood, blind on the one side, and his right hand shot out and slammed the sergeant's head against the barrel so that would crack. Someone laughed. The laugh was desperate. It was the sound of a sheep trying to learn to bark at a wolf. Ramsay came at the sound with 2 of his chosen guards and saw a mess where he had demanded neat lines. He drew his knife. "Stop," Wolken said, before he could stop himself. His voice was small in the big yard. Everyone heard it. They heard it because nothing they were doing was working, and so any different sound drew the ear. Ramsay turned his head slowly. "Maester," he said, "you have cured much. Have you cured hunger?" "No," Wolken said. He could hear his own heart on his teeth. "I have counted it. That is the closer skill." He lifted his chin a little. "If you kill him, you will have to kill the next one and the next. Soon there will be no one to count with me. You cannot flay arithmetic." It might have been a clever speech if given by a man on a day in a place with weather. Here it was simply air. Ramsay sliced Wolken's shoulder with a flick. "Then I will count," he said. Blood soaked the maester's sleeve. Wolken hissed and shut his eyes a moment so he wouldn't say something else stupid. Ramsay's knife stayed out. "Bring me the dogs," he said. "If men cannot learn from men, perhaps they can learn from dogs." In the kennels the hounds whined and wagged their tails with the hope dogs have because they were dogs and hope was their nature. Ramsay stood in the doorway with his knife. The nephew sobbed where he huddled, his bitten wrist bandaged badly. The Wheaton bitch looked at Ramsay with a frank gaze that was not fear because she had known his hand when it threw her meat. He tugged at her chain and brought her into the yard. Men made a circle because everything wanted to be a show. Ramsay gestured to the bloody-eared man who had cracked the sergeant's head and to the man who had laughed. Because I admire a sense of humor, he said, smiling like a blade. He made them kneel. He held the bitch's head and opened her mouth and showed her teeth. Hungry, he cooed. We must all be hungry. Something in that moment, as bright and small as a bead, rolled across the yard from man to man. Wolken, with his hand clapped to his shoulder, saw it. Shame. Not for pity, not for the kneeling men, for themselves. A shame at what they had been made into. He had never thought the day would come when men inside Winterfell would look at Ramsay and not see a shield but a mirror. The Wheaten bitch looked up into Ramsay's face, and for a heartbeat there was recognition there. Oh, you again, and a hunger she couldn't contain. Ramsay was slow. He took too long to savor his own drama. The bitch's very, very simple world shifted a fraction and snapped into a new alignment. She saw his mouth. She smelled meat. She leapt. Her teeth grazed his jaw. He swore and shook her off with a kick. The yard went still, because the air had changed, like a bell that had rung without someone striking it. The bitch landed and came again, and this time a guard stepped in with a boot and kicked her ribs, and she fell and lay for a moment without breath, eyes rolling. Ramsay laughed, relief spilling too much. He stepped forward, knife lifted. Bring the others, he said. We will. He did not finish. It wasn't that something dramatic happened. It was that nothing happened. The men around him did not move. He looked at their faces and found them suddenly opaque to him. It was as if the theater he had been staging had an audience that refused to sit or clap. He had never encountered that before. For a long moment he stood in the yard with his knife and his breathing and his rage, and there was no man in front of him who wanted to be the person in that next scene. He did the only thing he knew how to do then. He struck at what he could. He cut the kneeling man across the cheek. Blood sheeted. No one moved. He drew back his arm to strike again, to make the scene move, to jolt it into the old grooves. A crossbow bolt struck the snow near his foot and quivered. He turned and saw the guard who had loosed it. Young, pale, eyes too wide. The aim had been shakier than even fear would have required. The guard swallowed. He had fired near Ramsay's foot, not at it. That tremor of mercy was enough to break something else. Ramsay shouted and ran forward and seized the guard and beat him with the flat of his knife, spittle at his mouth. The world narrowed into one man striking another in the yard of a great house in winter. There was no nobility in it, no shape that could be put into a tale. It was this smallness that undid him. Men saw him exactly sized. Stark men are not clever, so the South says, but they are slow to change their mind. Once changed, it does not change again. 3 men stepped between Ramsay and the guard, not raising their hands, only taking a stance that said, "Enough. Put me on the wall," Harold Karstark said then, suddenly and almost amiably. "And I will shoot a Stark through the eye when you tell me, my lord, but I will not do this." And he turned and walked away. That was the first defection. It made a path that had not been there. Others put their feet on it. Jon saw the shifting on the walls from the ridge and felt the new shape of it enough to take the risk he had been saving like a last piece of bread. The signal went out. Not horns, not drums. A man jogging quietly along the line saying, "Now!" The Vale men moved with the neatness of habit. Wildlings moved with a joy in sudden action that lifted them like wind. Davos took a line of Northmen to the east gate because sometimes the simple way is the only way that works. They went in silence until silence was wrong, and then they went with a howl. The arrow fire that had been deadly 4 weeks ago now went high and late. A postern gate opened and then stuck, and then men inside shoved at it with numb hands because a decision made once was making itself faster than they could think about it. A chain snapped. A wedge moved. Winterfell, which had been a drum someone beat, became a bell someone cracked. The fight inside the first yard was close and stupid and human. Men slipped on ice and cursed. An axe bit wood and then flesh. Jon moved with his purpose clear as a line drawn. He did not want to make a pile of bodies to measure his success. He wanted to pass through into the heart of the house. He and Tormund and half a dozen others moved like water seeks lowest course. They knew where the Great Hall was because Winterfell had been theirs once, and houses do not forget those who love them. 1-1 came last. like a memory of giants walking before men had built anything worth a giant's notice. Arrows stuck in him like brooches and made him grunt and pull them out one at a time with a mild annoyance that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with size and stubbornness. Children on the walls cried out in voices that had not been trained yet to be cruel, "A giant!" and were hushed. In the great hall, Ramsay tilted a table over and sent plates crashing not because it made a barricade but because he could not bear their order. He set his back to a pillar and breathed through his teeth. The hounds howled like a choir heard through a wall. He had never thought men might walk into his hall with calm in them. He had thought they would come screaming so he could be braver than them. Now Jon walked through the doorway with his sword low and a stillness in his face, and Sansa came behind him, not because she needed to be there but because she refused to be elsewhere at the end of the thing that had defined her season of hell. "You should have charged," Ramsay said. He was modern enough to find words for what had been in him all this time, this need for others to move him. "You should have come at me when I told you to." "I did what you would not do," Jon said. "I waited." Ramsay smiled. It was the old smile. He could still summon it. "I will cut your brother's throat in front of you," he said, out of habit, as one does when one has no new thought. "He is with my sister," Jon said, and marveled to hear himself say it. "He sleeps?" And as he said it he knew it was true because he had left his hand there on Rickon's head when he went, and he had felt sleep come through, soft as a tide over wet sand. Ramsay went for a knife. Jon parried without thought. Swords rasped because they always do when two men close. The clatter echoed in a hall once full of music. Ramsay fought like a boy who had been allowed to win all his games by owning the boards on which they were played. He was quick and he was not stupid. He had learned enough to make a cut that left a line of heat under Jon's ribs. Jon had learned other things. He had learned how to come back through pain. He had learned how to press even when his body told him to stop. He crowded Ramsay, put him back against the pillar again and again, until the other man realized that the pillar was not a comfort, only a thing that kept him from slipping where he wanted. Jon slammed the pommel of his sword into Ramsay's cheek, hard. He opened the man like a door. Ramsay slid to the ground, gasping. "Hold," Sansa said, as two wildlings stepped forward, teeth bared. They halted because authority, when spoken in the right voice in the right hall, holds even men who do not owe it anything. She went to Ramsay. He looked up at her. He had not believed she would stand there again with her eyes steady. He had not believed an auburn-haired girl could grow into a lady with a face the wind had taught. "You will die," Sansa said. "I have reason for it. I will not pretend I do not want to watch." She glanced at Jon. "But there is a way that is there and there is a way that is ours. Which would you have?" Jon's chest hurt from exertion and from the old wound that lived underneath. A house guest he could not evict. He looked at Ramsay and felt anger like a log ready to be kicked. He did not kick it. "Yours," he said to Sansa, because he had promised himself he would not make this choice for her again. "Winterfell is your home. He stole it from you in ways a man cannot always count on fingers." They did not drag Ramsay to the yard. They walked him to the kennels, where the floor was packed earth and straw and the air was a stew of smells. The hounds lay thin but alert, their eyes bright because they are creatures of attention. He looked at them and for the first time did not resemble them. Sansa stood with her back straight, hands at her sides. She did not look at Jon. She did not need to. "Dogs remember who feeds them," she said, and did not say anything else. It was not a speech. It was a sentence. Ramsay laughed, a laugh that asked the world to return to its old shape. It did not. He had been a man who thought he was a god because other men had told him stories that made that easier for them. Now he stood in a kennel while two of his guards, no longer his, took knives and cut lengths of chain. The wheaten bitch, ribs a little too sharp under her fur, stood and wagged her tail as if a game was on. Ramsay's eyes met hers. He had never believed anything would love him except fear. He put a hand out. The bitch sniffed it and then licked blood where it had dried at his wrist. He made a small, involuntary sound. Men around him heard it and did not feel pity, but something more complicated and more terrible. and understanding that every man has noises he makes when he is a child again for a heartbeat. Then the bitch's nose caught the iron-sweet smell rising from the cut on his cheek, and the chain moved, and the men stepped back, and the door of the pen came open. Sansa left before the end. Jon stayed. He thought it his duty, though he would never name the emotion that made him stay. He had seen deaths that mattered. He had seen deaths that were waste. He had seen deaths that turned the world. This one was not any of those things. It was a piece that had to be taken off the board because it had been placed there by a cruel hand. Ramsay's last sounds were not words, not truly. He might have believed that if he said the right thing he could make the scene move a different way. Men believe many things at the end. The gods listen in their own fashion. Afterward, snow fell as if nothing in the world had weight. Jon stepped out of the kennel into it and let it hit his face. For a moment he was a boy again, stomping in drifts with Ghost a white streak beside him. Then Sansa came out and looked at him, and he was a man again. She did not cry in front of him. He did not either. Between them was something no words wanted to hold. They buried their dead with the deliberation of people who intended to live where their dead slept. The Bunnell boy who had laughed as he died. The old Northman who had not gone soft enough to break. Two wildlings who had never imagined a life inside stone but had come to it and were as surprised as anyone. The giant one had taken more arrows than any book about giants would think necessary. He had bled in the yard in a great wet circle and had looked around once, mild, surprised, and then had gone. They burned him on a pyre in the Godswood because the crypts weren't built for men like that. The weirwood leaves shivered and a small wind rose and spread the ashes. Jon stood and watched until he could no longer feel the heat. Men shouted in the great hall. Men toasted in smaller rooms. Lady Mormont sat at a table and ate stew and gave orders between spoonfuls. Baelish watched from a shadow where nothing stuck to him. He tried to attach a smile to Sansa's triumph. She let it slide off like sleet. "Congratulations," he murmured. "Winterfell is yours." "It always was," she said, and lifted her cup to her mouth and did not sip. He took the hint like a man taught to see too much. Davos came to Jon with a face that had gone hard in a new way. He held a carved wooden stag in his palm, blackened at the edges with soot. Jon looked at it a long moment and knew the name that came with it. He knew the look on Davos's face, the look of a man whose faith has been broken and who must do something with the pieces. Later, in a room too small for it, Davos faced Melisandre with the wooden stag between them, and his voice did a thing Jon had never heard from him. A break that was not age but a moral leaning. Jon left them. Some wars happen in small rooms. He had another war to think of. The Lords of the North, the ones who had come because hunger and honor had pointed the same way, gathered. They pledged not with a flourish but with a hand on a shoulder, with a "my swords," with a nod. Wyman Manderley sent a letter with blue wax that smelled faintly of fish and truth. The Glovers came, shame on their faces in a way that mattered more than any apology. The Umbers had to be sorted like coal from gold. Small John lay in a side room with his throat cut from a scuffle brought on by his habit of calling men soft and finding out which ones had gone hard. Some Karstarks bent. Some did not. The North was a land of hard decisions, and it made them as a man fells trees. One swing at a time until there is wood on the ground where air had been. They called Jon my lord, because someone had to carry the name of the house into the next winter. Some, later, in a hall with smoke curling and 100 eyes, called him king because men want a word to carry their hope. He did not look like a king. He looked like a man standing in a place he had not thought to stand, who would do it because it needed doing. Sansa stood to one side. When the cries went up, "The king in the north!" she watched the men and then watched Jon, and her face was a white page with a complicated letter on it. Later, when they were alone with the cold, she said, "It is yours now." And he said, "No, it's ours." And that was true the way a vow spoken between people who have learned to distrust vows is true, cautious, careful, made of bone. Rickon walked the yard and touched stone with his fingers. He put his hand against the weirwood's trunk and looked up and said something under his breath and then said to Sansa, "She said to stay by the heart tree if I was lost." And Sansa nodded because that had been wisdom once and might be again. He ate like a boy and slept like a wolf and sometimes woke with a growl and then laughed in embarrassment. Ghosts shadowed him sometimes, and the sight of them together made old men rub their eyes. The snow took a breath and paused. The sky opened a blue eye. Men repaired what could be repaired. The banners that had hung flayed were taken down and burned because you cannot make clean use of something that dirty. The brand new Stark banner Sansa had stitched flapped with the vigor of a thing that wanted to be there. People came to Winterfell's gates with carts and oxen and tentative smiles, hoping for trade, for shelter, for justice that did not bite quite so hard. The glass gardens steamed. The kitchens learned a different rhythm, one that smelled of bread more than fear. The hounds, most of them, found homes. The wheaten bitch slept by the heart tree some days, head on her paws, as if she had found a story to end in. She would sometimes lift her head and look at the line where the snow met the sky and wag her tail, remembering some simple joy. At night Jon stood on the ramparts and looked north and did not forget that all this had been a reprieve granted by a season, not a conclusion. The White Walkers were not a tale anymore. They were a shape moving in his mind even on the quietest day. He leaned on stone that remembered his family's hands and felt the world's weight through it. "Winter is here," he said to the stone. It did not answer. Ghost bumped his hip and sat with the patience only wolves have. Sansa walked the hall and the yard with her eyes on everything. She did not want to become her mother. She did not want to become any man's idea of a lady. She wanted to become the person who could keep the yard full and the hall warm and the men looking not at the door but at their work. She sat with Bess by the kitchens and learned which barrel to tap first, which spices to hoard. She had the maester, Wolken, with his shoulder sewed and his eyes wide, taught to send ravens with a different script. He wrote in a hand that did not shake anymore. He had a scar under his chain, and it itched when he was tired. He felt alive in a way that was not exactly relief and not exactly guilt. Baelish tried once more to make a story of her. He stood in the godswood with the steam of the springs like a veil and said the words men in songs say, especially those who have trained their mouths to say them. She let him end. "You love a girl you made up," she said. "Go love her somewhere else." He smiled and did not move his feet, which told her what she needed to know. She did not invite him to leave. She let the North's air do that for her. He learned to wear thicker cloaks. Davos went south a little and north a little and around the yard a lot, making puzzles into plans. He spoke softly to men with loud anger. He found the right kind of wood for bow staves and the right men to bend them. He taught a half-dozen boys to count out loud who had never had to learn the pleasure in it. He went to the pyre where one's ashes lay under a crust of snow and said a prayer for a god he could not be sure of. Tormund taught a group of boys and girls to throw axes, badly at first, then in a way that made him grin. He stared at the walls and shook his head and told the story of a time he had made love to a bear, and the children shrieked, and he laughed until it sounded like relief. He had lost many men and would lose more, but he had brought his people into a place with warm air under the floors. He would never understand stone, but he would learn to sleep inside it because the cold he knew was coming would not argue. Jon and Sansa stood together in the godswood one morning when mist made the world close around them. The weirwood's face looked down with its old grief. Jon touched the bark with a glove. "Thank you," he said, "to the tree or to the air or to Sansa or to the boy sleeping and the woman cooking and the men mending boots." Sansa did not mock him. She stepped closer and put her hand next to his on the red-veined white and said nothing. He felt the heat of her through the furs. They stood like that and then stepped back. "We waited," Sansa said. "We starved him and he was what he was. He died that way. It was the only way he could," Jon said. He looked at her and thought of all the ways he had failed and had not and all the ways she had failed and had not and how those added up to the moment they were standing in. He did not say any of that. He said, "We will have to do it again." Not to him, to the night. "I know," she said. They walked out of the godswood into a yard bright with snow. Men were laughing again, the deep kind of laughter that builds a world so it can carry weight. A boy and a direwolf ran past them on some errand so urgent it would not wait another heartbeat, which probably meant a crust of bread or a good stick. The sound of a hammer on iron came from the forge. The smell of soup came from the kitchens. Winterfell breathed as if it had lungs. The ravens sat black in the white and watched, bright eyes on everything, clever as always. The banners moved in light wind with a soft sound like hands applauding a tale well told. And far to the north, where the snow did not end and the air had edges, shapes moved that men at Winterfell could not see yet and would not ignore when they did. But for a day, or perhaps 10, the castle whose stones had known children's laughter and the crush of boots and the scrape of steel could be what it remembered being, even in winter. A home made of promises kept, of patience paid for, of hunger endured until it became a kind of strength. Jon stood with the wind at his face and the words in him like bone. We wait, and when waiting ends, we do the thing that must be done. Sansa stood with the wind at her hair and the weight of a key at her belt and the feel of a house that had decided to be itself again. When night fell, it was a proper winter night, clean and cold. Fires threw halos of orange around them. The sounds of the hall died down to a murmur. Ghosts slept under the window. Rickon dreamed quiet, for once. Bess, in a pallet near the ovens, dreamed she was running and not from something but with something. Wolken, in his cell with his chain on its peg, dreamed he was outside the walls, walking in a snow that did not tire his legs. Davos dreamed he was counting and the numbers laid themselves out in a path he could follow, steady as a rope down a dark stair. In the dark, unseen, Frost wrote delicate messages on glass gardens, and the broken tower mended a little where men had propped it with timbers. The heart tree did what trees do. It listened. If gods had anything to say about any of it, they said it in a language stone has always spoken and men have learned, slowly, to hear, the language of weight and weather, of patience and alignment, of force applied in proper time. Winterfell, which had been a problem, was again an answer. Snow fell. A wolf howled very far away and then nearer. The night took the sound and did not yield it back. The world was cold and it was alive. The world was ending, as always, and just then the world was beginning, as it does.